On this episode of the Ask Mike Reinold Show, we talk about bracing during lifting and athletic movements.
The Ask Mike Reinold Show. Helping people feel better, move better, and perform better.
Before we get to the podcast, I wanted to make sure you knew about my free online course on the Introduction to Performance Therapy and Training. If you want to learn how to get started optimizing and enhancing performance, this is the course for you. Head to mikereinold.com/performance to sign up today. Welcome back, everybody, to the latest episode of the Ask Mike Reinold Show. I am here with the crew of Champion PT and Performance up in Boston. Let's see, who do we have today? We have Mike Scaduto, Dave Tilley, Lenny Macrino, Dewesh Podell, Lisa Lowe, nailed it first time, Kevin Coughlin, and Dan Pope. We are here answering your questions. Anything you want to talk about, physical therapy, sports performance, fitness, business, career advice, head to mikereinold.com, click on that podcast link, and you will see a form that you can ask us questions to. Len, one student today. It's been a long time since we had one student. As our ACCCCE, are you slacking? What's happening right now?
This is a very unusual time to have a small gap when we have other students. We have two students coming in like 2 weeks, I think, 2 or 3 weeks. So it's all Michael. So we have to have a quota of at least 3 Michaels in the building, and we had that, and now we have 4. So
we have too many.
Yeah, we have a lot. So when in doubt, just ask if Michael's around. So we have Michael Berra from Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee. So the lone survivor from the winter into the spring.
Yeah, congrats, Mike. Michael, how's it feel to be the lone student right now? Is it an honor or is it daunting?
It's definitely an honor, I'd say.
Well, you're doing a great job. What do we have for a question today?
So today, Danny from Denver is asking, they said, my boss does not believe in bracing a muscle while weightlifting. He says that it blocks the joint from its full range of motion and is not a natural way to go about movement. He cues exhaling at the start of your squat. I think everything has a place and time depending on the person. What are your thoughts on bracing when you lift? Calling for a friend.
So I think we need to start classifying questions, and this is a funny one. I think we're going to classify this one as we are the argument breakers. I think that's what people are trying to do with us here. And I love when I love when it involves like your superior, like your boss too, and this is your forum. And I love how you used your name, Danny. So I was in my mind, I was like, should we change the name? And I'm like, no, Danny put their name. I'm going to go with it. So Danny from Denver, I love it, picking a fight with their boss. That's fantastic. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. And I think you kind of started to answer it yourself, where there's maybe a time and a place for everything. But, the thing that I thought was funny about the question was that, you said he cues exhaling at the start of your squat, and you could argue, is that bracing or is that a bit of a form of bracing? So, maybe this is a bigger topic, but who wants to start with this? Maybe, Dewesh, you want to start with this from the strength and conditioning standpoint? Like what is our standard practice? Maybe when you're teaching somebody new, how to do something, maybe we just say a squat because that's probably what we're doing, but I guess it could be anything. But what's our standard practice at Champion when we're teaching our athletes how to do movements?
Yeah. So I'm gonna make this as simple as I can. I think bracing definitely has a time and place, and it's definitely got its value. With that said, I think there's 2 camps of people, right? I think there's the camp of people that think that for every exercise you gotta brace your core to a max effort and look like you're about to poop yourself. And then there's the other people that seems like Danny's boss that don't want to brace at all. Well, I think there's gonna be a middle ground. What I always tell people is, the number one thing that's going to be the most important is alignment and position, right? So before you think about bracing, can you just get into a good squat position where you're not crumbling your spine just because you know how to do a squat pattern, right? Or a hinge pattern. The secondary thing on top of that is it should be load dependent. So if you have a sub-maximal load, right? If you're doing your warm-up sets and stuff, you don't need to be in a full brace. You don't need to tension your abs as hard as you can and, do a Valsalva maneuver and hold your breath for something that's sub-maximal. But if you're doing 3 rep max, 1 rep max, bracing really hard with your core, with your lats, let's say on a deadlift, and holding your breath on top of it to pressurize your entire spine and your intra-abdominal pressure and create a ton of that, it's probably going to be the best way to keep you safe on a maximal lift. So time and place, but prioritize position alignment first.
Right, and safety is relative, right? If Lenny did that, we may have to get the blood pressure cuff out to see if he just just had too much of a Valsalva maneuver. I mean, I think that's really well said, Dewey. And it's a maximal brace, you could argue, isn't super functional for movements, right? So if you're doing an actual movement and you're maximally bracing, I kind of get that concept, right? Because you don't want to do that, but there's definitely a time and a place to maximally, that's a weird word, brace, right? And like maybe you're trying to maximize your force output. Is this like maybe in the middle of like a competition, right? That type of thing. I mean,
Yeah.
who wants to jump in on that and maybe talk about when it's a good idea to have a maximum brace? Dan?
Yeah, I think I think the boss is right. Danny's boss is right, is that when you're trying to create spinal stiffness, if you brace, you're going to stiffen your spine more. And I think the breathing out versus breathing in for weightlifters, generally during the hardest part of the lift, you have a big breath in and you hold that breath, and that increases intra-abdominal pressure and that increases spinal stiffness. And all those things are supposed to be positive from a weightlifting perspective. So I guess the question was specifically for weightlifters. My question for Danny's boss would kind of be like, why do you want more range of motion in the spine when you're doing a lifting task, right? Oftentimes we don't really want extra range of motion. I know that's arguable, right? Maybe some folks want a little more extra range of motion in the spine, but generally we're looking for more stiffness, right? We're looking for the strongest possible structure when you're trying to lift as much load as possible. So if it is a true weightlifter, so weightlifters are doing 1 rep maxes as part of their, sport, we probably want to create as much spinal stiffness as possible. So you probably do want an aggressive brace. You probably want to breathe in. I know people are going to argue about that, but all the top weightlifters are usually breathing in and then they're holding their breath to create more stiffness during the hardest part of the lift, and maybe exhale through that sticking point, right? But generally speaking, they're holding their breath and they're trying to create as much stiffness as possible. So for the weightlifter, I think learning how to do that well is going to help you lift a bit more weight. So I would definitely try to practice that. But again, I think it depends on the person. Like, do you need to brace maximally when you're putting your shoes on? No. The amount of contraction probably has to be proportionate. I know Lenny maybe does. Again, it depends on the task. But for a weightlifter, yeah, you probably do want that and you want to train that.
So. And it makes sense. I mean, that's almost the concept of proximal stability, to have distal mobility, which I think is a good thing for this situation. And let's say, I mean, if you are talking about something like a deadlift or a squat, I think the concept of bracing there is like, look, I want to make this a hip pattern or a knee pattern, right? I don't want to make this a spinal flexion extension pattern. So I'm trying to brace to prevent that compensation movement, right? In the athletic concept, though, and this is an interesting one. Maybe get Mike Scaduto's thought on this one here too. But on the athletic concept, right? Like I always think sometimes that maximal brace, maybe it's too much a little bit. Like I don't think anybody's running around playing a sport maximally bracing, right? They may have like a low threshold of brace going on, but like any thoughts on like, Mike, what do you do with like your golfers? You're doing core work with your golfers. You're doing some exercise for them. Do you have them brace? Do you have them just do like a set maybe? Like, I don't know, setting maneuver? Like what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say along the same lines as Dewey and Dan, when we're in the gym and we're training, if we're doing something at a higher load with the golfing athletes, it's going to be the same idea. What do we cue in terms of, in their golf position when they're actually playing golf? We're still looking for alignment and posture, and being able to maintain alignment and posture throughout the swing. I think that has implications on mobility, that has implications on power output in their swing, how to utilize the ground. So we're not cueing necessarily a maximal brace, but we do want some kind of activation through the core, whether that's a slight tip of the pelvis into a slight posterior tilt or just a neutral pelvis. Will help activate some of the core muscles and help them utilize their core better in their swing. I think we see a lot of people that will lose pelvic positioning, which has all kinds of implications for stress on the lumbar spine. And if they're struggling with that, a simple cue of just a little posterior tilt or get their pelvis into neutral can help utilize the core muscles, take some stress off of their spine.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I feel like if you were to maximally brace, going back to Danny's boss, you would limit range of motion in this manner and probably a way that you wouldn't find beneficial. So, an interesting flip to that, right?
Yeah, and you could argue there's been some argument in golf specifically. To name drop a little bit, Bryson DeChambeau will use some breathing techniques before he hits his driver, but he's really trying to maximize his force output. So he does different breathing techniques, try to create some stiffness. So there are people that will do different things. They're at the very far end of the spectrum in terms of speed of their swing. But I think the normal recreational golfer doesn't need to create maximal stiffness, and that'll probably have a negative effect on mobility and maybe even their power output.
I'll bet though, just going back to the golf thing, because I was going to mention that I feel like a lot, if you look at golfers, I'll bet they are holding their breath when they're swinging to create, you know what I mean? Like DeChambeau takes it to an extreme because he's kind of like that. But I feel like when you're in that power, like production of a swing, you're kind of like, you're holding your breath, so to speak. Maybe I do it. Or maybe if we looked at it over golfers and really was able to analyze this a little better, I'll bet there's something to it. Maybe even in like rowing, like the pull of the row or something like that. I'll bet there's something to our breathing patterns that when you have to do something big, you create pressure in your body. You know what I mean? And when you're doing a 1 rep max, like Pope said, then you're definitely gonna create that to create some stiffness. But that's my chiming in and throwing it back to you guys. Is there something to that?
Yeah, I'll just add one more thing into the more bracing specific, and I think Dan talked about this, but the manner in which we brace our core, I think, is very important. I think a lot of people struggle with this, and they tend to, if they're using breathing to create bracing of the core, a lot of people breathe into their upper chest and kind of suck in through their abdomen, which may not be an optimal way to do it. So I think bracing technique and learning how to brace correctly, creating that intra-abdominal pressure with some lateral expansion is a key part of this, and making sure that you're doing it correctly is the whole deal.
Awesome. What else, Dave? Did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to share that on the rotational aspect of power. I mean, you guys would know more with baseball, but I remember reading a lot of Stuart McGill's work when he was studying MMA fighters, and the people who can like punch and or kick the hardest are able to have like a really coordinated bracing strategy where they can hold their breath and brace their core quite intensely. And they measured that with EMG. And so the people that could kick the hardest and throw the hardest punches, which is just rotational power, came from those who are really good at bracing and breathing with like impulses really quick, which probably make an argument that transfers for baseball and golfing as well.
And I think that goes more to the transfer sequence than actual bracing, right? So you could again actually argue, like outside of the Dan Pope situation, right, where we're trying to maximally squat or something like that. If you just held a maximum brace the entire time during an athletic motion, that may be bad. It's about the sequence of that, of when you have that maximum. And yes, and I think that goes to Lenny's point with golf, right? Yep. It's almost like you have this like setting, and then right, and that's right. Interesting. I can't wait to see that transcription of that, but I think it'll be really easy. Lisa, in terms of like skill wise with a rower, do you coach the breath? Do you coach the bracing like through the stroke? Tell us about that.
So I think what Dave said in terms of like the ability to have coordination with your bracing is mostly, what like a rower has to become good at. Because a rowing stroke is essentially a repetitive deadlift or squat, right? So you're needing to protect and utilize your spine every stroke. So there's different camps, like with everything in terms of breathing techniques, but it's definitely something that people work on. And there's different rhythms depending on how hard you're working or how fast you're moving. But there's, generally every technique is that you end up with an inhale before you apply pressure, for the same reason as when you're lifting, typically you increase that abdominal pressure to create a little bit more spinal stiffness as you're at the like bottom of your squat, bottom of your deadlift, max load point. So it's the same thing for rowing in that way. And kind of as we've been talking about this, I'm like, man, what if you didn't practice bracing your core in the gym? What the heck would happen when you're on the water? And like, you would fall apart. Like you would, you know what I mean? It's one of those, like, if you don't practice the coordination in that really controlled setting, and then especially with rowing, you have wind, you have current, you have other people in your boat, you have this, you have that. And like, if you're not practicing the coordination and the feeling of even that maximum kind of core feeling versus sort of the functional moving core feeling, like, I don't know how you would maintain it for an entire race or an entire practice, without sort of that feedback that you can try and recreate, as you get tired or as something weird is happening in the boat so that you protect your spine. Now, granted, back pain's the biggest thing in rowing, right? So maybe people aren't the best at that always, but still, like, if you don't practice it in the gym, if you don't practice it when you're moving on land, how is it going to go well with the coordination and everything on the water,
What do you got, Dan?
I just had a question for Lisa, and maybe it's a stupid question, but when you get tired, obviously you start breathing faster, right? In rowing, I don't know what the stroke rate is generally, but if you're doing like 30 plus strokes per minute, are you breathing fast so that you can create pressure at the same time as your breath?
Honestly, that's a piece of your training in some ways, is like being able to maintain good breath patterning when you are moving that quickly, to get as much air in and out as you can, but still have your breath timing support your back and your stroke. Because it does. If you like watch rowers, right, it's just like, I feel like with a running race where people like collapse across the finish line or whatever, right? It's like, as you come across the finish line, I feel like that's one of the things that immediately, like, people switch to like a really, really rapid breath pattern as they're able to let their body relax and not be like rowing. Because I'm just trying to think of what I end up usually doing. If I'm at like race rate, I think I inhale, exhale up the slide, and then exhale as I push. So it's like 2 full breath cycles per stroke at like a 34, 36 per minute stroke rate, right?
That's a lot of breathing.
So it's a lot of breathing. You have to be really good at the timing of it. So, it's a really big part, like being able to maintain that proper coordination of core bracing is a really big part of keeping your body strong and powerful, and like your spine safe when you're at those high effort levels.
Well, Danny, I don't know if we helped your argument or we muddied the waters more, but hopefully there's some things to consider. I think that it just shows you there's never one answer to any question, right? We could go on about this like for hours, but if you have a question like that or a fight to pick with your boss, head to MikeReinold.com and click on the podcast link, and you can fill out the form to keep asking us more questions to get you in trouble at work. Thanks again. See you on the next episode.